go for it. Straight up to you.
Yeah.
Then who's the chair? The formal structure carries on like this.
Alright, well I'm going to read...
Can you just give everyone a beer break for 2 seconds? Right?
Yeah.
Straight off.
Well,
But use the bar anyway. I mean, the
I
bar's
don't mind
open.
if people are using the bar whilst I'm talking.
I do that.
Alright, can I start?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Right, I've got this book, Happiness, Poems After Rimbaud. I think most people in the room will know that Rimbaud was a French poet in the 19th century. He started writing poems when he was 15, gave up when he was 20. But the reason I wrote this book is because a lot of romanticism is attached to it about the poet Maudit, about just taking drugs and having lots of sex. If there's anything wrong with that, but there's a lot more to his writing than that. But having said that, these aren't really translations of Rimbaud at all. They're improvisations of them. So there'll be a few images from Rimbaud's poems, and then a lot of, well, it's just me, or poems after Rimbaud. And it's really an account of what's happened over the last year. And I hate improvising in my speech, so I'll just read from all these bits of paper for the next 20 minutes. This first thing is called Letter on Poetics, and it's kind of like the postface to the book, so it kind of explains its rationale.
So anyone premiered in Edinburgh?
Yeah, I read it.
Have you read it since?
No.
You said it was very difficult.
It's fucking hard work, man.
Double space.
So I see you're a teacher again. November the 10th was ridiculous. We were all caught unaware. And that we is the same as the we in these poems as against them and maybe against you, in that a rapid collectivizing of subjectivity equally rapidly involves locked doors, barricades, self-definition through antagonism, etc. If you weren't there, you won't get it. But anyway, a few months later, or was it before, I can't remember anymore, I sat down to write an essay on Rimbaud. I'd been to a talk at Mark's house and was amazed that people could still only talk through the myths, Verlaine, etc., nasty-ass punk bitch, etc., gun-running colonialism, etc. Slightly less about that last one. As if there was nothing to say about what it was in Rimbaud's work, or in avant-garde poetry in general, that could be read as the subjective counterpart to the objective upheavals of any revolutionary moment. How could what we were experiencing, I asked myself, be delineated in such a way that we could recognise ourselves in it? The form would be monstrous. That kind of romanticism doesn't help much either. I mean, obviously, a rant against the government, even delivered via a brick through the window, is not nearly enough. I started thinking the reason the student movement fucked up was down at the fucking slogans. They were awful, as feeble as poems. Yeah, I turned up and did readings at the student occupations, and frankly, I'd have been better off just drinking. It felt stupid to stand up after someone had been doing a talk on what to do if you get nicked or whatever, to stand up and read poetry. I can't kid myself otherwise. I can't delude myself that my poetry had somehow been tested because they kind of liked it. Because, you know, after we achieved political understanding, our hatred became more intense. We began fighting. We were guided by a cold, homicidal repulsion, and very seldom did we find that sensation articulated in art or in literature. That last is from Peter Weiss. I wondered, could we write a poem that, 1, could identify the precise moment in the present conjuncture, 2, name the task specific to that moment, i.e. a poem that would enable us to name that decisive moment, and 3, exert force in as much as we would have condensed and embodied the concrete analysis of the concrete situation. I'm not talking about the poem as magical thinking, not at all, but as analysis and clarity. I haven't seen anyone do that. But still, it's impossible to fully grasp Rimbaud's work, and especially A Season in Hell, if you have not studied through and understood the whole of Marx's Capital. And this is why no English-speaking poet has ever understood Rimbaud. Poetry is stupid, but then again, stupidity is not the absence of intellectual ability, but rather the scar of its mutilation. Rimbaud hammered out his poetic programme in May 1871, the week before the Paris communards were slaughtered. He wanted to be there. He kept saying it. The long systematic derangement of the senses, the eye is another. He's talking about the destruction of bourgeois subjectivity. Yeah, that's clear. Yeah, that's his claim for the poetic imagination. That's his idea of what poetic labour is. Obviously, you could read that as a simple recipe for personal excess, but only from the perspective of police reality. Like, I just took some speed, then I smoked a joint, and now I'm going to have a Pepsi, but that's not why I'm writing this, and it's not what it's about. The systematic derangement of the senses is a social senses, okay, and the I becomes another, as in the transformation of the individual into the collective when it all kicks off. It's only in the English-speaking world, where none of us know anything except how to kill, that you have to point simple shit like that out. In the enemy language, it is necessary to lie, and seeing as language is probably the chief of the social senses, we have to derange that. But how do we get to that without turning into lay-mass conceptualists trying to get jiggy with their students? You know what and who I mean. For the vast majority of people, including the working class, the politicized workers and students are simply incomprehensible. Think about that when you're going on about rebarbative avant-garde language. Or this, simple anti-communication borrowed today from Dadaism by the most reactionary champions of the established lies, is wordless in an era when the most urgent question is to create a new communication on all levels of practice, from the most simple to the most complex. Or this, in the liberation struggles, these people who were once relegated to the realm of the imagination, victims of unspeakable terrors, but content to lose themselves in hallucinatory dreams, are thrown into disarray, reform, and then with blood and tears give birth to very real and urgent issues. It's simple. Social being determines content, content deranges form, etc. Read Rimbaud's last poems. They're so intensely hallucinatory, so fragile, the sound of a mind at the end of its tether and in the process of falling apart, the sound of the return to capitalist business as usual after the intensity of insurrection, the sound of the collective I being pushed back into individuality, the sound of being frozen to fucking death, polar ice, it's all he talks about. Okay, I know. That kind of drags us back to the romanticism of failure, and the poet Maudit, that kind of gross conformity. And in any case, it's hardly our conjuncture. We've never seized control of a city. But I don't know. We can still understand poetic thought in the way I, and I hope you, work at it, as something that moves counterclockwise to bourgeois anti-communication, like all of it, everything it says. We can engage with ideas that have been erased from the official account. If it's incomprehensible, well, see above. Think of an era where not only is, say, revolution impossible, but even the thought of revolution. I'm thinking specifically of the West, of course. But remember, most poetry is mimetic of what some square thinks is incomprehensible, rather than an engagement with it. There, the phrase went beyond the content. Here, the content goes beyond the phrase. I don't know. I'd like to write a poetry that could speed up a dialectical continuity and discontinuity, and thus make visible whatever is forced into invisibility by police realism, where the lyric I, yeah, that thing, can be one, an interrupter, and two, a collective, where direct speech and incomprehensibility are only possible as a synthesis that can bend ideas into and out of the limits of insurrectionism and illegalism. The obvious danger being that disappeared ideas will only turn up dead, or reanimated as zombies, the terrorist as a damaged utopia, where all of the elements, including those eclipsed by bourgeois thought, are still absolutely occupied by that same bourgeoisie. I know this doesn't have much to do with poetry, as far as that word is understood, but then again, neither do I, not in that way. Listen, don't think I'm shitting you. This is a situation. I ran out on normal life around 20 years ago. Ever since then, I've been shut up in this ridiculous city, keeping to myself, completely involved in my work. I've answered every inquiry with silence. I've kept my head down, as you have to do in a contra-legal position like mine, but now, surprise attack by a government of millionaires. Everything falls to the surface. I don't feel I'm myself anymore. I've fallen to pieces. I can hardly breathe. My body has become something else, has fled into its smallest dimensions, has scattered to zero. And yet, as soon as it got to that, it took a deep breath. It could suddenly do it. And it passed across. It could see its indeterminable function within the whole. Yeah. That wasn't Rambo, that was Brecht, but you get the idea. Like on the 24th of November, we were standing around outside Charing Cross, just leaning against the wall and that, when out of nowhere, around 300 teenagers ran past us, tearing up the Strand, all yelling, "Whose street's our street?" Well, it cracked us up. You'd be a pig not to answer.